Well, this girl kind of lights up and she goes, oh, God, this book is so fascinating. It's interesting. It's helpful. It's a book I've been looking for. And she says, it shows, the subtitle is Why Religion Poisons Everything. She said it shows how religion has been nothing but a negative effect on culture throughout the history of the world. It shows how science has disproven God. It shows all of these ways religion is false. I finally said to her, I said, okay, what does it say about Jesus? And she kind of pauses and goes, think of the nicest person you know. I said, okay. My late grandmother's image came to mind, perhaps the sweetest lady who has ever lived. And she said, you have that person? I said, yes. She said, Jesus was just like that person. He wasn't the Son of God, wasn't born a virgin, didn't die on a cross and resurrect. He was just a really, really nice guy. And all I could think of was to ask a question. I said, if Jesus was just a nice guy, then why did they crucify him? I mean, even the Romans wouldn't crucify Mr. Rogers, right? Can you imagine the Romans going, man, this guy Jesus, he tells stories, he talks to children, he's so nice, he's given us a guilt complex that we're not nice enough. Let's publicly shame and torture him and make an example to the world about niceness. Now, honestly, there are some good, thoughtful, difficult questions that we as Christians need to be ready to answer. That's not one of them. Friends, Jesus was not crucified for being a nice guy. You know what Jesus was crucified for? Not anything he did, but for who he claimed to be. Jesus was put to death primarily because he claimed to be the Messiah and the Son of God at his trial and the King of the Jews. That's why he was put to death. You see, the Christian story either rises or falls on the truth of the resurrection. By the way, at Biel, I teach at Talbot Theological School, and I teach a 3-day class on the resurrection. 6 to 8 hours lecturing a day. There is unbelievable research on this. We're not going to go in that depth, but I want you to know there's so much more behind what I am saying. What you might consider this a single presentation for people who are curious, typically enough to answer the questions, but just know that it goes obviously much deeper than this. Now, what's fascinating about the resurrection is there was a movie in the year 2000, and it had the actor by the name of Antonio Banderas in it. If you don't know who Antonio Banderas is, he was the voice for the cat in Shrek. Got it? Well, in this movie, it was a fictional movie, early 2000s, and Antonio Banderas plays a former Green Beret who becomes a Catholic priest. And right after he becomes a Catholic priest, a body is found in a rich man's tomb with a coin dating to Pilate from the 1st century. And of course, in the movie, they think they found the body of? Okay, like 4 of you got the right answer. If you don't know the answer to a question in a church, just say Jesus. And you'll get it right half the time, right? So they think they found the body of Jesus. And again, in the movie, the Catholic Church goes into an uproar and calls in the priest Antonio Banderas, because his background is a Green Beret, to kind of research and investigate this. And there's a fascinating scene in the movie where the first time he walks in the tomb, there's this kind of cussing, drinking, smoking, two-dimensional agnostic in the movie too, like just generically portrayed, the two of them. And he walks in the scene, you see this look on his face. And the reality is like, oh my goodness, if this is the body of Jesus, everything I believe is false. Now the movie, it's like a B flick that TNT probably shows at midnight, but the premise is fascinating. You couldn't make a movie of any other religion except Christianity, because Christianity is based upon a single, testable, historical event. Quite literally, everything rests on the resurrection. So I tell my students, I say, look, if there's contradictions in the Bible and Jesus actually rose from the grave, Christianity is true. It doesn't make contradictions unimportant, but the heart of our faith is resurrection. If some kind of evolutionary process happened and Jesus rose from the grave, Christianity is true. It is the heart of our faith and our beliefs. In fact, if the resurrection happened, I think it answers 3 of the biggest questions we have about life. The resurrection answers 3 of the biggest questions we have about life. Number 1, does God exist? If Jesus actually rose from the grave, then God is real and God exists. Now, how can I make such a claim? Imagine you go walking outside and my real Ford Fusion is out there. And what's your name, Pastor? Avalon, that's right. Pastor Avalon is out there, and I walk up to my car, and there's a huge dent in the front of my Ford Fusion. I go, Pastor, what happened? He goes, man, I'm really sorry. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. He goes, I saw this feather floating down. It hit your car and totally dinged it up. Now, you wouldn't believe that, right? If it was a Chevy, you might. But clearly not with a Ford. Now, we wouldn't believe it and he wouldn't say it because an effect that great requires a sufficient cause. If somebody lived 2,000 years ago and said, I'm going to die and be buried, and on the 3rd day rise again, this calls for power, a power over life and death. It points to the very God's existence that Jesus believed in. If Jesus rose from the grave, we have an answer to the question, is God real? Does God exist? Second, we have an answer to the question, which religion is true? Which religion is true? Christianity is uniquely based upon a single, testable, historical event. Buddha allegedly said, according to Houston Smith's book on Buddhism and World Religions, he attributes to Buddha, if somebody said, if anybody does a miracle, that person is not a follower of mine. Basically, in meditation, you want to empty your mind rather than use your mind to investigate reality. Christianity actually is based upon this event. If Jesus rose from the grave, it's like God's stamp of approval, so to speak, on the Christian faith. So I even tell my skeptical friends, I'm speaking soon to a group of atheists, and I'm just going to say, look, I'm not even going to argue that Christianity is true. What I'm going to argue is, if you want to investigate religions, begin with the resurrection. Because if Jesus rose from the grave, we know Christianity is true. If he didn't, you can rule out Christianity and continue with your investigation. If Jesus rose from the grave, God exists and Christianity is true. But third, there's life after death. There is life after death if Jesus rose from the grave. Now, how does this follow? In the early 90s, there was a movie some of you may have seen called Flatliners. Remember this movie with Kevin Bacon and Oliver Platt, Julia Roberts, and Kiefer Sutherland, right? Jack Bauer was in the movie. And they're medical students, and they want to know if there's life after death. So instead of reading religion or philosophy, what they do is they take turns flatlining each other's heart, and then they resuscitate themselves back to life and ask them, what do you see on the other side? Now, the movie has kind of this Eastern religion kind of angle that it goes, and clearly it's a morbid experiment. Do not try this at home. But the thinking actually makes sense, doesn't it? If you want to know if life continues after the grave, talk to someone who's dead and who's been there and who can come back and tell us about it. In that movie, they go 15 seconds, and they keep upping the ante till about 4 minutes or so where there's brain death. Well, Jesus didn't die 15 seconds or 4 minutes. He died and rose on the 3rd day. And it said to his apostles, in John, in his final speech, he said, I'm going to die and go prepare a place for you with my Father. Friends, if Jesus rose from the grave, God exists. Christianity is true. And life continues after the grave. That's the power of the death and resurrection of Jesus. It quite literally is the heart of our faith. Now, the moment we start to investigate this, what will happen in our culture that's so deeply influenced by the worldview naturalism is people will assume, well, that's a miracle. We know miracles don't happen. Science can explain everything. Therefore, no matter how strong the evidence we give you, there must be some better naturalistic explanation. I teach full-time at Bio, but I still teach 3 mornings at a private Christian school where I used to teach full-time. And probably 12 or 15 years ago, I started taking students on apologetic mission trips. We go to Salt Lake City and knock on doors, which is fun because so many of them have knocked on our doors. And many are willing, even if they don't have time, they're like, I knocked on doors and got rejected. Come on in, let's talk about Jesus. But I also got students, I'm like, we need to take our students to the most godless, secular place we can think and bring in atheists, agnostics. So this March, we're bringing a group of students to Berkeley. And we've been there 4 or 5 times before. And one of my favorite college ministries is on the campus at Berkeley in terms of impact. Grace Point Church is unbelievable. But we come and we bring in students and we interact there. Well, on one of our first trips, I met with a group of students there, and they found out I was coming 2 weeks later to do training for a whole different reason and asked if we could hang out. I said, sure. It was a PhD physics student and a math major at Berkeley. Obviously smart students. We sit down kind of in the grass, the extended area by Sproul Plaza, and I'll never forget the physics student looks at me and he goes, if you believe in a resurrection, you contradict science. I said, tell me why. He said, science tells us that dead people stay dead. If you believe they don't, you're contradicting science. I said, okay, let's talk about this. What science does is it observes how the natural world operates. When left to itself, when people die, they stay dead. I said, you're right. Naturally speaking, when people die, they stay dead. The resurrection is not a claim that Jesus rose naturally. The claim is that he rose supernaturally. So the only way you can say science rules this out is to prove to me that God doesn't exist. Because if God even possibly exists, then a miracle is possible. I said, why would you begin an investigation by ruling out a miracle before we even look at the evidence? I'm not going to assume miracles happen, but let's not assume they don't. Let's look at the weight of the evidence and be willing to follow it. Aren't scientists supposed to be open-minded? And we had a great conversation. We went back and forth. So here's what happens. There are certain historical facts that virtually all New Testament scholars and historians agree on surrounding the resurrection. Certain historical facts that are so well attested that they're almost universally agreed upon. People don't differ over the facts. They differ over the best explanation or the interpretation of the facts. It's an issue of worldview. So I was speaking outside of Fresno in Sequoia National Park up at Hume Lake the summer before last. And I learned something that was fascinating. We went to this old, I think it's called the General Noble tree. And this tree is believed to be the largest tree that has ever existed. And it takes 18 people hand in hand around the base of it to get around the size of this tree. Well, it turns out in the late 1800s that some explorers started coming west and saw the sequoia trees. But as they gave people reports of the sequoia tree, people wouldn't believe that it was real because it was just too big. So they come back and they cut down the General Noble tree, kind of like a pie into slices. Bring it to the Chicago World Fair at the end of the 19th century and set it up for people to see. And still, some people wouldn't believe it. Google it. Look, if Google says it, that settles it, I believe it. You actually can Google stories about this. It's called the Great California Hoax. People wouldn't believe it. My question is why? They had testimony from people. They had eyewitness empirical evidence. Why wouldn't they believe it? Because the assumptions they brought to the table are that trees don't get that big. So when you are presented with something that challenges your assumptions, you have one of two options. Either change your assumptions and your view of the world, or dismiss the evidence. You see the challenge? When presented with great evidence for the existence of sequoia trees, people dismissed it because it didn't fit their worldview. People do the exact same thing with the resurrection. If you assume God doesn't exist, miracles don't happen, then no amount of evidence I could give would convince you. I just ask you, as I do many of my non-believing friends, be open. If the evidence is good, would you be willing to follow it where it leads, or are you closing off an investigation before it even starts? That's an important question. So my father has an interesting perspective because he's going to share a story later today, but he set out to disprove Christianity in the 1950s. Really tough, broken background to show that it was false. Ended up being surprised by the evidence. God drew him by his love and transformed my father's life. So in the early 70s, he wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And this book has sold over 4 or 5 million copies, plus distribution worldwide. I don't even know how many millions of copies. Updated 80s, 90s. And 2 years ago, we updated this book together. And it was fun to work on this with my father, but I wanted a little historical perspective. So I kept asking him, how is the manuscript evidence different? How has the archaeological evidence changed? How good are the arguments compared to when you first tried to disprove Christianity and were amazed by the evidence? And he used a metaphor with me. He goes, son, there's a tsunami of evidence. Now, if you know my father, he's probably never understated anything in his entire life. So just this phrase, tsunami of evidence, like he's just larger than life. You see what he's wearing today, right? That's who he is all the time. So partly I'm like, okay, tsunami of evidence, what do you mean? He goes, son, I'm telling you, when I set out 5 decades ago, there was good evidence, but there is so much more. We're in a golden age of stuff we're discovering, showing that Christianity is true. So I got the idea. I was like, I bet I could write an op-ed on this called There is a Tsunami of Evidence for the Christian Faith. Wrote it for my dad with some help. He approved it. He's like, that's what I would want to say. Submitted it to Fox. And the week that went out, the book Evidence launched into number 16 on all books on Amazon. Isn't that incredible? What does that tell me? That tells me that people are open to evidence. They do care about truth. And these issues still strike a nerve, because even a 700-page reference book, I think the only book that beat it that week was a book by Bob Goff. I'm like, okay, I'll lose to Bob Goff. That guy's just awesome, right? I'm okay with that. Why do I tell you that? Because number one, the evidence continues to grow. We have nothing to be afraid of by challenges to the faith. Nothing to be afraid of challenges. And second, it goes much deeper than we can in this time. But let's jump in. I'm going to look at 3 facts. Basically, historical scholars will say there's roughly 12 historical facts that are so strongly confirmed, virtually all New Testament scholars will agree on these. I want to make the minimal case we can and just point to 3. Fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus died by crucifixion. By the way, we're going to walk through all 3 of these, so we're going to have a lot of time for interaction and questions. So how do we know Jesus died by crucifixion? Well, one way to look at this, interestingly enough, is to examine the medical evidence we have about the death of Jesus. Now, if you look in John chapter 19, it describes something very interesting. That Jesus is put on the cross, spear goes in his side, and what comes out of it? Blood and water. Now, John wasn't a doctor. He was the one who went to the cross and saw this. He's just reporting what he saw. Well, if you read church fathers as far as I have, they think this is like metaphorical. It's the water of baptism. It's the water of new life. Like they're trying to make sense of why water would come out of the body of Jesus. But in 1986, there was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. You can Google this and read the whole thing. It's called On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ. And it was a historian, theologian, and a medical doctor, and it's peer-reviewed. And they walked through the way somebody was whipped in the time of Jesus, carrying the cross, the nature of crucifixion from a medical perspective. And they argue that on the cross, you didn't die of blood loss. You would die of asphyxiation. Because to breathe on the cross, you'd have to go up and down and just imagine the pain. Sometimes people were on the cross for days just wasting away. And eventually, to speed up death, they would shatter the shins, and then you couldn't get enough air. Eventually, you'd asphyxiate. But what they argued in this article is when somebody died of this manner, a watery type substance surrounds the heart called the pericardial sac. So if somebody died in that manner and they were pierced with a spear, take a wild guess what would come out? Blood and water. Now, it's hard to make a medical diagnosis of something 2,000 years ago. We have to be careful, but that's a really interesting scientific confirmation that Jesus was dead. Now, here's how else we know he was dead. The Gospels are 4 distinct writings. All 4 say he died. The rest of the New Testament writings, Peter's writings, Paul's writings, John's writings, say that he died. Early church writers, outside people like Ignatius and Polycarp, Clement of Rome, say that Jesus died. Even Tacitus, a Roman, and Josephus, a Jewish writer, mention the crucifixion of Jesus in the time and place that the scriptures put it. So that evidence Jesus died by crucifixion is about as strong as we can know anything historically speaking. By the way, 2 other points I find fascinating. If you go back to the 1800s, there were all these alternate theories for the resurrection that were popping up. Maybe the apostles stole the body. Maybe they went to the wrong tomb. Maybe it was a legend. And there's a guy named David Strauss who's a critic, and he said the idea that Jesus didn't die is preposterous. Why? He said, imagine somebody goes through the whipping Jesus went through, the nature of crucifixion. He's encased by all of the coverings they would bury somebody with, put in a tomb. Somehow he magically takes this off, pushes the stone back, defeats the guard, and then shows up to his apostles and says, look, if you believe in me, you can have a resurrection body like mine. What would they say? Get this man a doctor. They would never think you have magically conquered death. Even a critic at that time, David Strauss, is like, this is crazy. And by the way, one other point, just to make sure this sinks in. In Deuteronomy, it says if somebody is hung on a tree, that person is cursed. That person is cursed. Why would the apostles invent the most shameless death for their Savior when they're trying to convince people to believe this message is true? It makes no sense to say that our Messiah, our King, was shamefully put to death in an honor-shame culture. Makes no sense. Friends, medically, historically, textually, theologically, Jesus was dead on the cross. Virtually all scholars accept this. Now, the second fact that's very interesting is that the tomb of Jesus was found empty on the third day. The tomb of Jesus was found empty on the third day. Now, I've seen over 20 arguments for the empty tomb. Don't worry, we will not unpack all of those. Let's just consider 2 or 3 of the more common and I think powerful arguments for the empty tomb. Now, if you read the gospel accounts, who is consistently recorded as discovering the empty tomb? The women, Mary and the other women. Now, you probably read that 100 times. But have you ever thought about how interesting and significant it is that women discovered the empty tomb? See, in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered as significant as a man's. Why? It was a patriarchal culture, for one, and a woman was not educated like a man. So the more significant an event was, the less likely they were to rely upon the testimony of a woman. So put yourself in the position of the apostles. If they're inventing a story based upon the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus, and it's not true, and they're trying to convince people it's true, who are the least likely witnesses they would invent? This is the participatory part of the program. Don't say Jesus. I guess I asked for that one. The women. It would make no sense. So the best explanation is they report women discovering the empty tomb because that's what they truly believed happened. Second argument is, think about this. What is the first naturalistic explanation to counter the resurrection we read about in Matthew? That what happened? Disciples stole the body. Now, if you say the disciples stole the body, what is that conceding about the status of the body in the tomb? It's gone. You don't say the dog ate my homework if you have your homework, right? The dog ate it is an excuse because you don't have it. The very first naturalistic explanation recorded in Matthew and then later by other church historians is that it was passed by the religious leaders of the time, the disciples stole the body. Well, that concedes the tomb is empty. So number one, it's reported by women. Number two, the first naturalistic explanation says the disciples stole it, which assumes the body was gone. Third, Jesus was crucified publicly in a way that people knew. Crucifixion was not in a corner. It was a public event by the Roman Empire to shame the person and to make a point about what would happen if you betrayed or stood against the Roman Empire. That's the kind of punishment that it was. So they knew what had happened to Jesus. Now, given that this was public and he was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, you realize how unbelievable it is? We know the name and the position and the economic status of the person who buried Jesus. It's actually pretty incredible to think about. We know Joseph of Arimathea reported in multiple sources buried Jesus. Jesus died publicly, put in a known tomb. Where would be the most difficult city to proclaim an empty tomb and a resurrection on the face of the planet? What city? And don't say Jesus. Jerusalem. They go to Iran. They go to Lebanon. They go to Egypt. They go to Turkey. They go to Texas, for crying out loud. They would go anywhere but the very city where they could test and investigate and go pull out the body and end the resurrection claims right on the spot. But they don't. In fact, at Pentecost, do you know what the apostles say? They say, this Jesus was crucified and you know this is true. It was done publicly. So these are just three reasons, but think about it. They report women discovering the empty tomb would be totally counterproductive. The first explanation says the disciples stole it, which assumes the body's gone. And they go right back to the city within weeks and publicly proclaim a risen Jesus in a way it could have been investigated. Minimally, that shows unbelievable confidence that they're proclaiming that the story is true. So we know Jesus was dead. And amazingly, the tomb of Jesus was empty. Now, third is this. Now, I'm going to phrase this very carefully. The vast majority of scholars will concede that the apostles had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. Let me say it again. Virtually all scholars will concede that the apostles had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. So if you say the apostles didn't see the risen Jesus, you have to come up with another explanation to account for why they all believed that they had an experience of the risen Jesus. Does that make sense? It's not enough for a critic to say you're false. They have to give a better explanation for the facts as we know them. Okay, now why would people believe this? Well, one very interesting source is in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. If I could give one piece of evidence for the death and resurrection of Jesus, it'd be 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5. Now, why? Write that down and go read it. It's so fascinating. We unpack this in evidence, if that's helpful. But Paul writes 1 Corinthians in the mid-50s. So we're dealing 20 to 25 years after Jesus died. So there would be many people still alive that were there during the time and events of Jesus. But notice how Paul starts 1 Corinthians. In verse 3, he says, I pass on to you of first importance what was also passed on to me. And then he recites what's called a creed, a short summary statement that Paul has inserted into his letter. So what Paul is about to read in this letter predates the letter itself and gets us closer to the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the question is, when did Paul get this creed? Well, we know he visited the apostles at least twice. It tells us in Acts in the beginning of Galatians. 3 years after his conversion, and then 14 years later. I won't walk through all the particulars. You can go research and study it, but I think a very strong case can be made that Paul was given this creed within 3 years of his conversion, within 4 years of the death of Jesus. And what does the creed say? It says that Jesus died according to the scriptures, he was buried, and he rose according to the scriptures. He appears to Peter, the apostles, he appears to the 12, and he appears to the 500. Friends, we have a creed about Jesus that can be dated very confidently within 3 to 5 years of the beginning of the Christian movement. Historically speaking, that's unprecedented. Some of the first biographies of Buddha are 300, 400, 500 years removed. Same for Alexander the Great. We have 4 biographies of Jesus, certainly within the first century, letters written earlier, and creeds embedded in those letters within the very decade that Jesus walked the earth. And the heart of that creed is the death, burial, resurrection, and appearances of Jesus to all the different groups. Minimally, belief in the appearances of Jesus are very, very early. Now, with that said, why else should I believe in it? A skeptical friend of mine said, look, he goes, if Jesus really rose from the grave, why didn't he appear to Pilate and be like, boo, ha-ha, you thought you had power over me? I have power over you. I said, okay, so just help me make sure I understand where you're coming from. Are you telling me that you know how Jesus could have more effectively gotten his message out to the world? Because it sounds like you know better how to get followers than the person to whom more people throughout the history of the world have followed. Please tell me I'm all ears. And this is a friend, so I can give him a hard time. But it's kind of crazy to think, well, Jesus should have done this. I'm thinking, well, he was pretty effective in what he did. But did Jesus appear to anybody who wasn't his follower? Why did he just appear to his followers? And you know, the answer is yes. Number one, he appeared to Saul, who was out persecuting Christians. And you realize virtually all scholars will concede that Paul had an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus. Some will say, well, it wasn't Jesus, it was schizophrenia, or it was some other explanation they'll try to account it. It's described 3 times in Acts in the beginning of Galatians. He tells the story himself. So he did appear to those who didn't believe him. Who else did he appear that didn't believe in him? James. If you read Mark 3 and John 7, the family of Jesus thought he was out of his mind and didn't believe in him. They were embarrassed by him. And yet James becomes the leader of the early church in Jerusalem, In fact, in AD 62, he's martyred and put to death, Josephus reports, because of his commitment to the church and the person of Jesus. What led to his conversion? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, and then he appeared to James. You know who else was not a believer he appeared to? Thomas. By the way, we need to stop calling Thomas Doubting Thomas. He was not a doubter. Thomas was not a doubter. To doubt is to say, well, maybe, maybe not, I'm not really sure. In fact, you can doubt something and still believe it. Doubt doesn't mean you don't believe something. That's why in Jude 1 it says, have mercy on those who doubt. James didn't say, well, maybe he appeared. I guess I believe you, but I'm not sure. James said, I will not believe unless you appear to me. That doesn't sound like a doubter to me. That's a straight skeptic who rejects it. He appears to him, and then he comes to believe. Friends, all scholars believe Jesus died on the cross. A high percentage believe that the tomb was empty. We have good evidence for it. Virtually all concede that the apostles of Jesus had experiences that they believed were of the risen Jesus. Now, let's look at two quick objections. I'll show you what this means, and then we'll open it up and we'll talk about this. How do we know the apostles didn't steal the body? That's a common argument. Maybe the apostles came and stole the body. Well, to me, this is maybe one of the worst, shallowest arguments you could make. Why? Number one, there were guards in Matthew. Now, it's only reported by the guards in Matthew, so historically speaking, it has less value than, say, the women discovering the empty tomb, which is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So from a historical perspective, the guards are a piece of this, but it only takes us so far because it's only mentioned in Matthew. But second, if the disciples stole the body, then they were intentionally propagating a lie and a false message, and they knew it. So why would they go steal a body and go intentionally put themselves in harm's way to get threatened, beaten, put in jail, and some of them martyred for something they knew was false? Friends, that doesn't make sense. By the way, if the apostles stole the body, you still don't have an explanation for the conversion of Paul and or James. So it doesn't get us all the way there. Friends, there's no good reason to think the apostles stole the body. The biggest objection on an academic level is that the apostles had hallucinations. This one is debated in the literature, but there's a number of problems with it. The biggest problem is that hallucinations do not appear to groups. You can no more have a group hallucination than you can have a group dream. Sorry to fans of Inception. You can't, could you imagine how cool it would be if you actually could share a dream? You know how much money I could save? Instead of actually taking my wife to Hawaii, I could say, honey, I just woke up. I'm on the beaches in Maui. Go to sleep and join me. And we'll just, we'll chill on the beach. We'll go swimming. We'll go snorkeling. You cannot share a dream. You cannot share a hallucination. They're internal, subjective projections onto the world. And yet all the accounts we have are that Jesus appeared to the group of the 7, the 12, the 500, the apostles with Thomas, the apostles without Thomas. For that reason and many more, hallucinations don't work. By the way, even if there are hallucinations, then what happened to the body? That still can't account for the empty tomb. So you see what happens is there's these different facts that we know historically surrounding the person of Jesus. And there's only one explanation that can account for all the facts. And that's the story that Jesus claimed to be God. He died, he was buried, he rose on the third day and actually appeared to people. That's the only one. It's the only explanation that accounts for all the facts. So you have one of two choices. Either you have to dismiss the facts if you don't want to believe, or you shift your worldview and you be open to a new belief. That's it. I was just in Israel a week and a half ago, and I was at the two competing sites for where Jesus was crucified and buried. One's called the Garden Tomb, which looks like you want it to look like, but ironically, it's closed on Sundays. Is that messed up? I did like a Twitter video, and it got like crazy hits. I'm like, this is irony. Tomb of Jesus, closed on Sundays. But it's privately owned. And then there's a site called the Holy Sepulchre, which is earlier where the church is. That's probably where Jesus was actually crucified and buried near that. Well, I went to see these two sites, and it's fascinating. But something really hit me about this, is that one thing we know about crucifixion is that the person who was crucified was stripped completely bare. Utterly naked. Why? Number one, no protection on your body. Number two, to shame and humiliate that person. And don't raise your hands. Have any of you seen a depiction of the cross in which Jesus was actually naked on the cross? Probably not. Now, my point is not to say he should be naked on the cross. That might raise other issues. But have you ever thought about how clothing him on the cross shapes our theology? Go back to the garden. What happened when Adam and Eve sinned? They were naked and ashamed. So they hid themselves with plants and covering, and then the first death, Jesus put an animal skin over them. So their sin brought shame, brought covering. When God comes down in human flesh and becomes the true Adam who's obedient, to pay for our sin, what happens? He completely becomes unclothed to the world, bearing all our shame for us, so we don't have to carry that shame. That's the power of the cross. We now live in an honor-shame culture. You make one mistake, we will pile on you on Twitter and shame you. And apart from the cross, I don't know how we deal with that. The power of the gospel is that Jesus went to no lengths and utterly humiliated himself to cover and pay for our shame. That's the beauty of the cross, that when we see that, it means we don't have to live in shame. We don't have to live in fear and guilt and be hidden. Because what Jesus done, we can come out in the open with the right people and with the church and experience God's forgiveness and his honor for us. One last point, and we'll take questions. A friend asked me just yesterday, a couple days ago, who's a student at Biola. He goes, why do you believe in the resurrection? And I said, partly I believe in it because I think the historical evidence is there. But I said, I'll be honest with you. Even if the story were not true, I would still wish that it were true. I said, and I think you do too. He goes, what do you mean? I said, I think written on the human heart is that the greatest thing a human can do is sacrifice his or her life for another. So how many of you saw the recent Infinity War and Endgame movies? Let me see your hands. If you haven't, I'm going to ruin it, but sorry, you've had plenty of time. If you saw the Infinity War movie, there was a central moral question at the heart of this film. For what can we sacrifice a human life? For what we sacrifice human life? So the movie opens up, and Loki has a choice whether he will sacrifice his brother Thor to Thanos. The movie continues on. Star-Lord has a decision. Will he sacrifice Gamora to Thanos to get the Soul Stone? Movie continues on. Scarlet Witch, sorry if you don't know these names, just bear with me. Scarlet Witch has a decision. Will she sacrifice Vision because of the stone in his forehead to protect Thanos from getting the other stone? And then finally, there's a decision with Iron Man and with Doctor Strange. Will he allow Iron Man to die to protect Thanos from getting the time stone. Now, in that movie, Captain America says, we are not in the business of exchanging lives until the only way to save the universe is the voluntary sacrifice of a human life. Think about that. Thanos, the bad guy in that movie, is willing to sacrifice other lives, utilitarian for the greater good, but he preserves his own. In fact, when Gamora discovers what Thanos has to do to get the Soul Stone, sacrifice something that he loves, she says, this is not real love. Because real love, as Jesus said in John 15, is when someone lays down his or her life for another. Endgame climaxes. There is only one way to save the universe, that somebody willingly lay down their life for another. Now, there's not a resurrection in Endgame, but they keep this character, I won't say who it is, they keep this character alive through movies and reflection as if he's coming back to still shape their life. Do you notice how many movies are about death and resurrection? What about Big Hero 6? Remember the end? Sacrifices its life and then come back, the robot does, for the boy. How about Inside Out in that movie? That, I can't even remember the name of it, the friendly, created character, what is it, Bing Bong or something? Bing Bong. Sacrifices its own life to save the beloved character from this hell-like pit. How about the end of The Matrix? The greatest act is to lay down your life and be defeated and then come back. How about the end of Avatar? Jake Sully lays down his life and then comes back. How about the end of Harry Potter? There's death and there's resurrection. C.S. Lewis said, throughout literature in the history of the world, there's this sense that sacrifice and returning back from death is the greatest, most heroic act. It's as if God was preparing our hearts for when it would really happen in history. I believe in the resurrection because it's true, but it also brings meaning to the deepest desire, I would argue, in the human heart. And unless people see the goodness of what the resurrection means, then sometimes our evidence and our apologetics will fall on deaf ears. We need both. Time for questions. Are we done at 11:40? Or am I over? Okay, good. So we got time. Questions, thoughts, something that did make sense, an objection that you've heard, a challenge, a question related to this. How can I help you make sense of this related to the resurrection? That I can give you some recommendations. Yep, he's running the mic to you. Thank you, Tyler. Can you throw me my water buddy with the top on it? Trust me, he'll throw it without. Good throw.
Cool. Thank you, Sean. So I just thought of this as you were talking about group hallucinations. But I have some friends who go and do ayahuasca. And they talk
go
about
into what?
Do ayahuasca, DMT, and they have these group.
I don't know what that is.
It's a tea, and it gives you psychoactive experiences.
Oh, a physical tea that you drink. Okay.
Yes.
Got
Yeah. And they'll fast before
Okay.
they go into these things. But they come out and they'll have group experiences from this. So obviously you don't know about ayahuasca, so maybe there's not an answer. But this might be something on the radar going forward, because I know it seems to be growing.
So as a drug, it's growing.
Yes.
I've never heard somebody apply this distinctly to the resurrection.
I have not
as an
either,
explanation
but-
for it.
Yeah, but I just thought of
So
that with the group.
hallucination is a subjective internal experience. My guess as I look at this is that you have some kind of group experiences, but these group experiences bring out something that's already within your belief system and your paradigm that's there, and it projects it, and somehow you experience it together in some fashion. If you apply that to the resurrection, that wouldn't explain why they believe something novel and different in terms of saying, no, actually, Jesus has risen from the grave. The Messiah should be killed, and he should come back. So if this kind of drug happened, it would bring out a belief that they already had and not explain where that belief came from in the first place. That would be the problem of saying that that explains it. Second is, where's the evidence that they actually took this drug? I mean, it's one thing, see, my friend J. Warren Wallace, cold case detective, who became a Christian through forensically analyzing the Gospels, he said, in a court of law, he's never lost a case. He said there's a massive difference between possibility and probability. It's possible they took this drug you're talking about, had group hallucinations or experiences. Well, that's possible. But why on earth should a jury believe that that's the best explanation of the facts? So the person who throws this out as a possibility, I go, gosh, that's really interesting. Why should we believe that that experience is the best? Does that explain James? Does that explain Paul? I think it's going to be solely inadequate. The empty tomb, to explain all these facts as we know it, is how it would push back. So you'll hear these objections. On the surface, they sound kind of interesting. You start pushing them and poking them and thinking about them, and you just see that they begin to fall short. But that's very interesting. I've never heard of this drug or tea, whatever it is, before. Where can you get it? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Shameless joke. My wife likes tea, but she would not want that tea. Yes. Oh, he'll come around and get the mic.
Okay, so how do you explain the resurrection without using the Bible? Or can you?
Okay.
Or validate it?
So if somebody said to me, give me proof without using the Bible, my response would be, why should I start an investigation by dismissing the primary witnesses that we have about that investigation? Why should I begin by trying to explain an event that the Christians were most interested in weighing into? I mean, think about any other event tied to the Romans. Can you explain this reign without any Roman sources, without any Jewish sources? Rather, the question should be, given the sources that we have, are these good historical sources that sufficiently attest to credibly believing in this event? So, quite obviously, you're not going to have a lot of non-Christians attesting to the resurrection, because why would they say, yeah, Jesus rose, we just don't believe in it? They probably would become Christians if they believed in it. But what we do know from non-Christian sources would be, we know that Jesus lived, no doubt about that. We know that Jesus died. We actually know in the early 2nd century, because of Pliny the Younger, that people worshiped Jesus as if he was a god. We know from non-Christian sources that it was believed that Jesus had supernatural power. We know a lot of things surrounding the basis of his life, not even using Christian sources. But to me, the entire project, I would say, no, that's not how we do history. You don't start by dismissing a group of documents, especially when they're, even the New Testament, you have Gospels that are stories, primarily historical accounts. You have letters of Paul, letters of Peter and John. You also have Christians who knew John personally, like the 2nd generation of Christians who weigh into this. I want to know if these are good, reliable historical sources rather than beginning with the assumption of dismissing them. Now, I've had a couple skeptics say that's not good enough, and I say, okay, you've raised the bar of skepticism so high, I think you're actually hurting your ability to know truth. That's what I would say. Yeah, this is good. We're making a run back and forth. Good strategy. Keeping you in shape, Tyler.
So on the topic of group hallucinations, I think it's like a consideration to have where it's not really like a group hallucination, because I have friends who do drugs and it's more like they're all tripping, but then one person sort of suggests something that they see, like they're hallucinating, and then sort of the group kind of takes that suggestion and then projects it themselves. You know what I mean? So is it like...
So here's why I think this falls short. It's one thing while you're high and you're on drugs to be suggestive of something. It's another thing when you come back down to reality for those suggestions to take root and change your actual beliefs. That's a very, very different thing. So a couple weeks ago, we actually had a friend of mine who's a SEAL with us in a Navy SEAL on our trip to Israel. And one thing I've learned about the SEAL training is, number one, I thought I was pretty tough in basketball, but I do not have that extra gear to be a SEAL. Happy to admit it. A crazy ability. His philosophy is like, I will die before I quit. I was like, I won't die before I quit, but I can learn from this. This is good. And one thing that happens is some of the training for becoming a SEAL is so intense and rigorous, physically demanding, no food, no sleep, that some SEALs in training have had hallucinations. But what happens, as soon as they come back to it, they snap out of it. So to say that somebody has a high drugged or hallucinatory experience and others go, oh yeah, sure, I see that, is fine within that state. But I'm not convinced that that can change an entire group of people unequivocally on a belief so central as the resurrection, and then explain Paul, and then explain James. Plus, there's no evidence for any of these kind of drugs, them taking it. Nobody even hints at it early on. So I'm just going to be suspicious that although that's very interesting, it can happen on a limited state, that would explain the transformation of their beliefs. I don't think it's going to get us there. Does that make sense? That's a great question and very, very interesting. All the way over there, good strategy, man. I like it.
You made reference to a creed. What was the purpose of the creed?
So there's early creeds that we find embedded within the New Testament. So like Philippians 2, 5 through 7 is a creed, and we can tell by its structure, by the parallelism, how it's worded differently than the rest of the letters of Paul. So Philippians 2, 5 through 7, Romans 1, 3 through 4, and 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5. The purpose of these creeds were early statements in a primarily oral culture. When most people couldn't write things down, they'd say, here's the core of what we believe. If you're a Christian, you believe this, and it could be passed on from one person to another to make sure you are passing on the right tradition. So in the probably late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, as the Gospels and letters were being written down, some of these creeds were embedded within the letters, showing what the apostles and the early Christians believed from the beginning moving forward. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
So you're intimating that there was a confusion.
Hold it up there closer.
So you're intimating there was a confusion going on. Is that true?
It doesn't follow that there was a confusion necessarily. It follows that they're simply saying, here's what we believe. Let's be sure we're all on the same page. And you can pass this on easily to somebody else. Now, they might be wanting to avoid some kind of confusion, but it doesn't imply there was this mass confusion because they're saying, here's what it means to be a Christian. I think you see some of this confusion arising at the end of the first century into the second century with Gnostic beliefs coming in. Then you see more intentional efforts by the early apologists and fathers to say, whoa, we don't believe that. Here's what's always been taught going back to the beginning. So I don't think the existence of creeds themselves imply that there was huge confusion. It just was a quick way of saying, here's what we believe, here's the heart of our faith, pass this on to others who share the heart of our faith. All the way back there. Take your time, man. We'll wait. That's right.
Okay, so I'm kind of curious, right? So about this thing, in terms of apologetics, there are some people who try to prove a lot of things. There are some people who try to either validate or confirm what we already believe. I'm curious, it depends on what you mean by proof, right? That's always, we talk about it in school. So I mean, one of the objections that I hear always, I mean, many times, not always, a lot of times, is that is it fair that the historical studies, historical studies, we have a more modern invention, and then first century people was more of a world, quote unquote, mythological context where they didn't have a scientific and a modern objective historical perspective. So in some ways, I guess what I'm saying here is it, I mean, are we or are you after trying to prove by using modern historical or scientific method, or is your goal of apologetics more for reasonableness or plausibility of our faith? So I'm just curious, what is your sort of goal or your objective of this, your studies?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
The goal of apologetics is to be faithful to what Jesus and Paul modeled and what they teach in the scriptures. That's the goal. We are called in the scriptures, 1 Peter 3:15, sanctify Christ as Lord in your heart. Always be ready with an answer, the Greek apologia, the term apologetics, for those who ask, give it with gentleness and with respect. That's it. Apologetics is about being faithful to the task that Scripture lays out for us. Now you'll notice I never used the word prove or proof, because I think that carries with it, like when we think about proving something in math beyond a reasonable doubt. When you're dealing with history, and even certain things in science, we can't prove things definitively. In history, we have to ask the question, what's the most reasonable? Where does the weight of the evidence point? So I don't think for somebody to have a reasonable faith, they necessarily have to have apologetics. Paul writes in Galatians and Romans, he says, our hearts cry out, Abba, Father. That's why to me, when someone says, okay, I'm interested in apologetics, what should I read? I say, great, read the Gospel of John. The Bible carries authority within itself because it's the Word of God. And I can't tell you how many Christians will say, not a SEAL, but a Navy Ranger, an Army Ranger was with us. And he said he just started reading the Bible and was like convicted about this person of Jesus. It's true. And then he goes, I don't know how the Bible's true. I can't answer these questions. I need apologetics for my own confidence. So we're not proving things. Essentially, apologetics has this goal. Number one, strengthen believers. I think when we believe something, we discover the number of manuscripts. We discover a historical case for the resurrection. Go, wow, this is reasonable. There's good reason to believe this happened. You see the evidence from DNA or the origin of the universe. It gives confidence that this isn't a fairy tale, that this is really true. Second, it's not about proving to non-believers. Apologetics is a ministry of simply removing questions and doubts that people have on the way to the gospel. That's it. It's really a ministry to do that. So it's not proving things. It's showing that not only is Christianity true, but we can answer the toughest questions. Problem of evil. Jesus is the only way. What about evolution? And there's good reason to believe that Christianity is true. By the way, think about it. Jesus rose Lazarus from the dead, and they saw it. And they want to run Jesus out of town and kill Lazarus. Poor guy already died once, right? You can't, if you do a miracle in front of some people, they still won't believe. In fact, you look at Paul, he goes to Mars Hill and he preaches. Most people reject him, but a few came to know more. Apologetics is a part of theology, and it's one piece of evangelism for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. And it's not just for Bible teachers. C.S. Lewis said, we all are apologists. We're all called to be ready with an answer. The question is not, are we apologists? The question is, how good of apologists are we? So that's how I see apologetics played out biblically. Jesus did apologetics. Read John 5-8. He actually reasons. He says, the scriptures point to me. He says, Moses pointed to me. The Father points to me. My miracles point to me. Look at Paul in Acts 17. He, even with non-believers, does a kind of apologetic. The first church fathers are actually called apologists. So it's nothing new. It's always been a staple of the church since the beginning, but now the questions change a little bit, and with scientific advances, our knowledge changes a little bit. So how we do apologetics, our tools to do apologetics, the questions we're asking may change, but you go back to Peter's first message at Pentecost, and one piece of it is, Jesus died, he appeared to people, he did miracles, this is true, and apologetics is one piece of it. So that's it. I think right now we are bleeding a lot of young people who have no idea that this is actually true from the church and that there's good reason to believe it's true. We also have a lot of people in pews who know the story, but they don't know how to answer questions, so they're afraid to engage their neighbors. I found that when we learn apologetics in a gracious, fair way, it gives us confidence to engage our neighbors because Christianity actually makes sense. So that's it. I think that's the biblical task of apologetics. I appreciate you asking that. 2 minutes before, you have a question? Fast, and we'll get you out here at 11:40. Go.
How do we harmonize the accounts of the time period between the resurrection and Jesus' ascension? For instance, the end of Mark seems to suggest that it's a short time, whereas he's more engaged with the disciples, whereas the beginning of Acts is he's there for 40 days before ascending, and he's in the community
So the quick answer
revealing
is
himself to others.
there's not a direct contradiction between these. There's a difference in emphasis. So Acts is launching the beginning of the church, and Luke gives us a specific amount. Why doesn't Mark? Because the entire way Mark writes his gospel is he says immediately, immediately, immediately. He wants you to think that something happened fast and it was quick. Jesus went here, he healed this person, went there, threw out a demon, boom, boom, boom. And so Jesus, resurrected and then ascended. He's not saying it wasn't longer. He's creating a sense of urgency in his audience so it appears that way. It's not deceptive. It's a way of telling the story with a certain audience and emphasis to get your audience to respond. So there's a difference between a difference in the Gospels and a blatant contradiction in the Gospels. There's a lot of differences that we would expect if there are different eyewitness accounts. There's a few that seem to contradict, but I think there's plausible, reasonable ways to make sense of these. Keep that distinction in mind helps when we come across the different emphases. In fact, my friend J. Warner Wallace, he goes, in a court of law, when you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you have the commonality you would expect of different eyewitnesses, but also the differences you find across eyewitnesses. It has the ring of truth that they're not all copying from each other. Everything I mentioned about this session is in the book Evidence Demands a Verdict. There's a chapter in there that's almost the length of a normal book on the resurrection. And the goal was to say, I worked so long at this, if there could be one chapter making a case for the resurrection, hopefully this would be the best one that would be there. So if you want to take this a little bit further, I think you'll find it in that source. It's 11:40 on the dot. Go get some Chick-fil-A.
Go grab some lunch. Thank you, Sean. Go grab some lunch and then go find your next lunch lab.
Souls in danger, look above. Jesus completely saves. He will lift you by his love out of the angry waves. He's the master of the sea, billows his will.